We now begin with the sixth module of the Applied Linguistics course in the UGC program on linguistics, e-Pathshala on linguistics. And the sixth module is called Second Language Acquisition. We have already briefly talked about it. In this module, we will talk about in some more detail, although this is a kind of topic about which we will keep coming back to in different modules, and you will also read in much greater detail in your modules, different kinds of modules. As we already said in the last module, in module number 5, that the distinction has to be made between acquisition and learning, and some people believe that L1 is acquired, whereas L2, L3, L4 are learned. And this, we said, is not really true, because language is such a complex system. The level of richness and complexity, and the number of rules and the complexity of rules that one has to acquire in terms of phonology, which is at the level of sounds, morphology, in terms of words and their structure and their network, their relatedness, in terms of syntax, that means the term, the structure of the sentences, and in terms of discourse, what are the rules that govern talking to each other. And language is so complex that in principle it cannot be taught. You can't teach a language. You can only acquire languages. It happens to you, as Chomsky would say, language happens to us. Like walking happens to us and eyesight happens to us, so language also happens to us. So basically, essentially acquisition, but to a substantial extent, particularly in second language acquisition, there is a greater amount of learning, in particular lexical learning, and also some grammatical learning is involved. And we will try to see what are the different theories that have been presented by different scholars for L2 acquisition, very briefly in this module. You can also think of the number of situations in which you might acquire a second language is almost infinite. It can be very, very strange. For example, you may have parents speaking different languages, and you may have relatives speaking third and fourth language. It's quite a typical situation, and you learn many of those languages. Or, for example, you may learn a language at home, or two languages at home, and you may learn two at school. Very often the language of home and the language of school is so different that it has to be learnt all over again. Immigrants face different kind of situations, adult immigrants face different kind of situations, and children in schools face different kinds of situations, right? So the typology of language learning situations in wartime, in the post-war situations, all these are different contexts in which a second language may be learned. One of the most powerful theories that have been formulated, and which we will talk about in some more detail later, is the theory of interference, which is, particularly since the times of Robert Lado in 1950s, I think, it has been one of the most influential theories of second language acquisition. In very simple words, it says that since you already know one language, you have no choice but to acquire the second language in terms of your first language. That means the first language is definitely going to interfere with the acquisition, learning of the second language. As we will show as we go on, that if you already know some languages, it is actually an asset to learn more languages. Okay? But we must first understand the theory of interference. The theory of interference, you will also notice that most of the examples in the theory of interference, they come from the level of phonology, from the level of sounds, about which we have already talked. Okay, there is a problem at the level of sounds because your jaw and your vocal tract gets more or less tuned to 1 or 2 or 3 languages. So when you get into another language, it is difficult. Like imagine a Britisher or any European or a Spanish speaker, French speaker trying to learn Hindi. They are into trouble. We think we are into trouble learning English or French, but they are into far, far greater trouble. Okay? Because an Englishman or an English child even will have to, for example, learn the retroflex sounds. Retroflex sound, da 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 da. Now they don't have this position in their, the tongue curling back and touching the hard palate and then producing ta ta da da. No, they don't have this. These series they don't have. So if we have 5 such sounds, they will have hell of a time, trying to learn these sounds. Okay, so it's not. So that is the claim that the theory of interference makes. But we also know that many Westerners actually manage to learn these sounds if they try hard enough. Consider the case the other way around. Okay, the other way around means a Hindi speaker or a Punjabi speaker or Gujarati, Marathi, Bangla, all these trying to learn English. Now, when you say somebody asks you in India, how are you? You normally say, very well. This is how you say, very well. An Englishman is not going to understand what you are saying, really speaking, unless the context makes it very clear and he knows very well. The question is the words vine, vine, and wine, wine, are 2 very different words. Okay, and that distinction lies only in the first letter. V for victory and van and very, that v, and w, which is there in where, why, what, wine, etc. These are 2 very different sounds. Not in Indian languages. Indian languages we have only one v. That's all we have. Okay. So we substitute v and w. So v is spoken with your lower teeth, with your lower lip and upper teeth, and there's a lot of friction. And w, the lips are rounded and your tongue is pushed back. Wine, very, vine, wine. So that's the difference. So at the level of sounds, there is a serious problem, and I think the interference theory tells us that there will be a serious problem. I mean, this happens. The theory of interference laid the foundations of what is known as CA, that means contrastive analysis. That the claim was, and even today many people would claim, that if you compare and contrast the system of L1 with the system of L2, you can predict that what will be the errors, because L2 will be learnt through the window of L1. Take another example, the voiced aspirates. The voiced aspirates of Hindi and many other Indian languages which have, ghaja dhadha bha, gha as in ghar, jha as in jharna, and so on. So this series ghaja dhadha bha, which are both voiced and aspirated, aspirationals. No variety of English, so far I know, and many South Indian languages, they don't have these sounds, so they have great difficulty learning these. The theory of contrastive analysis was later challenged by many people because it had very major limitations. One of the major limitations of the theory of contrastive analysis was that how come children from different linguistic backgrounds make the same errors? For example, all children, whether they are from Japanese, Chinese, Hindi, Punjabi, Gujarati, Marathi, Tamil, whatever be their background, they will all make the same kind of mistakes in the use of articles, for example. How come all of these children, all of these students will end up saying, she walked to college every day? Why? Why is that the case? That is the case because acquisition of another language goes through certain stages. They will say go, good at some stage. Right? They will break consonant clusters like street, satreet. School will become either iskul or sakul. Consonant clusters will be broken by most people in the initial stages. Right? So that was a major problem, that why students from different linguistic backgrounds make the same kind of mistake. There were also issues of backlash effects. Now the backlash effects were sort of suggested, there were many examples given, that it is not just that L1 interferes with L2, but L2 also impacts L1, and may do some kind of damage to it. Damage in the sense that things may change. One classic example I remember from my own work is, the word chakkar, Hindi has chakkar. There is also chakkar in Punjabi, okay, to go around. Mandir ke chakkar lagana, ya Granth Sahib ke chakkar lagana. That in the Sikh temple it is called bead. So, as I told you earlier in one of the earlier modules, that a bus is bus in Yorkshire, right? And butter is bua or butter. Okay. Similarly, this boy who I was recording, he said, instead of saying they do chakkar around the bead, he said they do chukkar around the bead. So chakkar became chukkar, like bus being pronounced as bus. So there can be backlash effects. So people said, look, we should examine the L2 output in terms of error analysis. That was the other proposal, about that a new language is learnt on its own terms. So we should analyze the errors and the stages of acquisition in terms of the language, in terms of the target language, rather than in terms of the source language. That was the proposal. And it made a distinction between pre-systematic, systematic and post-systematic errors. Now, pre-systematic errors were those when the student made mistakes at random. Sometimes she would say she walks to college, sometimes she walked to college. Okay. Sometimes she would say good, sometimes she would say went. So there is no system. So these are called pre-systematic errors. The next stage was called systematic errors, where the learner is saying go, good. I told you earlier that is symptomatic of knowledge, not of ignorance. If a child says go, good, it is not ignorance, it is knowledge. Because she has acquired the knowledge, add ed to the verb to get the past tense. So if a child does that, and if she is consistently saying she walked to college, she walked to college, she walked to college, that means the error is systematic. The third category was that the errors could be post-systematic. That means now the child has learnt child has learnt the rule that the third person singular in the present tense will take the sir in the verb. So, we have to say she walks to college every day, she eats an apple every day. Now, if in this situation a child sometimes says she walked to college every day, then if we show her the sentence, she will immediately correct her sentence. That means she has the competence and has just it's a sort of slip, it's a slip of the pen, as they say, or the slip of the tongue, that she has made that mistake. Otherwise, she will be able to rectify. So, most of the errors, as we discussed earlier, other than some of the phonological errors, could be L1 independent errors. They have nothing to do with L1. So, like the errors of, let us say, past tense, go, goed, it has nothing to do whatsoever with the first language. The error of articles have nothing to do with the first language. We must therefore recognize, as we said earlier, that errors are necessary stages in the process of learning, in the process of language acquisition. There is another model proposed for second language acquisition, and this is called the speech learning model, SLM, proposed by various scholars who are all mentioned in your module, and they make a distinction between category assimilation, category dissimilation, merger, and empirical verification. So, these are the sort of four main points in SLM. Now, category assimilation means that you hear L1. First of all, the assumption in SLM is again at this level of sounds, that the sounds of both the languages or all the 3 or 4 languages reside in a common shared phonological space. So, they are free to travel here and there, okay, backwards and forwards. Now, in this shared phonological space, if you hear a new sound, you take it to the sound as close to your L1 category, and then over a period of time you probably come up with a new sound performing a merger. So, you combine them. But if you hear a sound which is similar to your L1 in L2, then you get into dissimilation. Then you want to make it as different as possible, because it's an L2 sound, as different as possible from the first language. So, this SLM is another hypothesis. Let me finally talk about the monitor model, or what is known as the monitor hypothesis, very briefly, and once again we will turn to it later in other modules, but it is the credit for this goes to Stephen Krashen, who is one of the well-known names in applied linguistics now and in L2 acquisition. Krashen basically says, as we have been saying, that languages are acquired. Languages are basically acquired. It's very difficult to say that you can teach languages and languages can be learned. So, you have to create an ambience, an environment where languages can be acquired. And he says that he has 4 or 5 hypotheses. First hypothesis is something that we have already talked about, that is the acquisition learning hypothesis, that acquisition is natural, learning is largely tutored. Then the very important hypothesis is called the monitor hypothesis. The monitor hypothesis is that everybody has some kind of an editor in the human brain. There is an editor in the human brain which once in a while formulates a rule, like a rule which says third person present tense singular, like he, she, it, then put sir in the verb, something like that. Or let us say forms a rule like that if you see, let us say, a word like kamra in Hindi, the plural is kamre. Now, is kamre plural or singular? Now, your mind may make a rule which says that if kamre is the subject, kamre अच्छे हैं, kamre लंबे हैं, then kamre is plural. But if you say kamre में किताबें हैं, that kamra is singular, because it has a postposition after that. So you can, internalize the rule. Suppose you are a Hindi learner, Hindi as L2, so you have to figure out that kamre can be both singular and plural. And the plural of that singular would be kamron. Kamron mein kitabein hain or kamre mein kitab hai. So you may figure out such rules. Now these rules are in your brain, and they work as editors when you are looking at your speech or at your answer sheet again, and you have written something like बहुत सारे कमरे में किताबें हैं, you would say no, here it should be कमरों में किताबें, बहुत सारे कमरों में किताबें हैं. So you figure out that the mistake is in the plural, and there are, you formulate the rule that the ending masculine nouns in Hindi have two plurals, one like kamre and the other kamron. In fact, as you will know later on, they have three plurals. When you want to say, you can take a word like ladka, so you have ladke, that's one plural. Then you have ladkon, that's the second plural. And then you want to call boys, they are playing in the ground, you want to call them in the vocative case, and then you say ladko. So you have three, ladke, ladkon and ladko. Hey ladko, idhar aao. Oh ladko, idhar aao. So such mistakes, the monitor, you have the monitor in the brain which can correct. Then there is the natural order hypothesis given by Krashen, that doesn't matter what is your L1, and maybe you have L1, L2, L3, but you are now learning L4. L2 will be learnt in the way children learn L4, same way. You have L1, L2, L3, three languages you already know, you are now learning fourth language. Fourth language is acquired in a certain order, there is a natural order. It will be acquired in that natural order. It will not be violated. Then the other hypothesis in Krashen's monitor model is the input intake hypothesis. This is an extremely important hypothesis, that to assume that lot of input will automatically become intake, no. Input means there may be language all around me, there may be a sea of language. But what will really become intake will depend on a large number of social, psychological, individual factors. Is my attitude positive? Am I open? Is the whole thing making sense to me? Only then input will become intake. And finally, there is the affective filter hypothesis. There have been a lot of critique of these hypotheses, there have been criticism, and there have been alternative proposals, but I think Krashen's monitor model still attracts us very much, because it is probably one of the most powerful hypotheses about second language acquisition. The affective filter hypothesis says that if your affective filter is low, that means if your attitude is positive, not negative. If your attitude is negative, then your affective filter is high. It's like this. The input is coming here and is bouncing back. But if it is low, that means your attitude is positive, you are willing, you are highly motivated, you are interested, then lot of input becomes intake. So the affective filter, the filter of emotions and of attitudes, should be low. Only then lot of input will become intake. So these are various proposals to explain how do we acquire a second language. I hope you find it useful. Thank you very much.